Last event of the day. Thanks, John. Good afternoon. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you to INSA for another great event. You guys do a fantastic job through all these. Google remains proud to be a longstanding partner of INSA and really appreciate everything you do for public-private partnerships here. As John mentioned, my name is Michael Falkowski. I lead our national security group within Google Public Sector. For those that don't know, Google Public Sector was established 3 years ago to help Google better support the unique needs of not just the national security space, but the U.S. federal government. And the team that I lead helps our customer missions across three primary areas. Resilience, whether we're looking at CONUS or OCONUS use of Google infrastructure and connectivity around the world. Security, leveraging Google's threat intelligence and the cyber defense approaches and technologies that we offer in that space. And this thing called AI. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. Google's pretty good at that too. So at the end of the day, what my team's role is to help take the things that you use from Google in your everyday lives to make your life easier and the really cool, innovative things that Google develops on a daily basis and bridge those to operate and deploy in the unique environments that our U.S. intelligence community needs to do to thrive and provide that mission lift. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And with that, it's a pleasure to introduce the moderator and guest speaker for our closing fireside chat. First, our moderator, Dr. Megan Anderson, is a member of INSA's Board of Directors and the Executive Vice President for Capabilities at IQT. In this role, she is responsible for implementing a strategic roadmap to deliver high-impact technical solutions across the national security community. Megan, we are grateful to have you with us to guide this important conversation. And joining her is our guest speaker, Dr. Rick Muller, the 6th full-time director of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, or as you all know it, IARPA. In this role, he leads groundbreaking, high-risk, high-payoff research that aims to solve some of the IC's toughest challenges and provide our nation with an overwhelming intelligence advantage. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Megan Anderson and Dr. Rick Muller.
Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Muller.
Good afternoon, Megan.
It's a pleasure to join you today at INSA's Spring Symposium. And I'm looking forward to discussing the ways that IARPA is moving emerging technology forward and sharing it with our audience. All right, so let's jump right in. So as the director of IARPA, you are in a unique position to see what's over the horizon. How does IARPA approach prioritizing R&D investment to ensure long-term technological advantage for the IC?
Thanks, Megan, and thanks for having me here. So there's a lot of technical development and technical acquisition that goes on across national security and the intelligence community. Much of it can be done by just evaluating the latest and greatest and figuring out, is this fit for our needs? Is this something that brings us a new capability? What IARPA wants to do is something that looks a little bit further ahead than that. We want to understand what things constitute an overwhelming technical advantage for the intelligence community. And very often that means doing something that everyone else thinks is impossible. And so that normally involves investing over multiple years at a fairly high level to develop a new technology. This model was pioneered by ARPA, which then became DARPA. And when we were stood up 16 or 17 years ago, it was largely to bring the same types of technical advantage that DARPA brings to the DoD to the intelligence community. We're a little bit different. We are smaller than DARPA. We work very closely with our contacts in the intelligence community. We're not looking to do the most amazing, hardest, impossible thing in the world. We are interested in doing the amazing, hard, impossible things that the intelligence community wants to adopt and further develop. So we work very closely with intelligence community contacts. Very often we are hiring our program managers from those intelligence communities who come with a bee in their bonnet about something really, really hard that they want to develop. And then very often they bring it back to their agencies when they rotate back. So we work closely with our needs. We are proud. We end up transitioning something like 70% of the projects that we run. And so, you know, so those are the types of things that we do to develop new technologies.
That's fantastic. And I imagine the problems people are coming to you with are non-trivial, so you have your hands full looking at that. So pulling on the thread of R&D investing, I come from a related world at IQT where we focus on advancing early stage commercial technologies for national security use. And a lot of what we are trying to do is canvas what's going on in the commercial market to find the best startups that are available that have technologies that the intelligence community can use today to advance their mission. For our organization and for IARPA, tech transition is really critical to achieving success. So what can IARPA funding do to help tech transition for the intelligence community?
Yeah, so you know, technology transition is really, really hard. And one of the things I admire so much about In-Q-Tel is that it complements so well what IARPA does. You know, I like to think that there's this kind of ladder of capability or partners you need to go from where IARPA ends investing in a product to where it needs to get before it is operationally useful. And you know, the Department of Defense is lucky in that they have this very rich ecosystem of people to kind of help with that maturation process. Because of course, there's, you know, very long-standing lucrative businesses that evolve from selling things back to the DoD over time. The intelligence community is much more closely held than that. I think we might be seeing some changes in that, maybe with dual-use technology. But we need all the partners we can get to kind of do that lift from where an IARPA project ends and then to where someone's going to be able to use it in either a commercial application or in some kind of operational use. And very often we are handing off directly to the intelligence community. But you know, sometimes you have great projects that just aren't at the point where someone wants to take it over yet. And so I think we need as many In-Q-Tels and as many different types of partners that can help us with that lift. And you know, there are places like, well, we just saw MAC from DIU. You know, CIA Labs is out there. There are a lot of organizations that kind of help with that technology lift across the intelligence community.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And one of the pieces that we've seen looking at commercial technologies is figuring out to be successful in tech transition, how do you have your end users have a view of the technology as you're going and doing the development? How do you provide it to them to do real-time evaluation and provide feedback before the technology is baked? And then how do you give them enough time to use the technology before they can get it acquired into their building? Building off of the last panels we just heard, that's non-trivial to do that. But a lot of it is thinking about how you keep your end user engaged throughout the project. And I think getting it out of IARPA into other entities or straight into the intelligence community so that there's buy-in throughout the whole process is really important to pull things along for the transition path.
Yeah, and we actually don't start a program at IARPA unless we've got multiple agencies that are willing to stand up and say, we need this technology. And we put them on the government advisory panel for each of our projects. They meet and review the project every 6 months. We're now starting to actually do early transitions to those agencies where, let's say if it's a software product, we'll be releasing software to those partners every 6 months just so they can see it evolve. One of the things IARPA then does is we do draconian down selections. We end up funding a number of people at the beginning of a project so that they can try wild and crazy ideas. And you know, some of those pay off and some of those don't. And as the ones that don't pay off, we prune those down. So at the end of the project, we know we've got, you know, several technologies that our IC partners can pick up and continue to invest in so that it makes a difference in their missions.
Yeah. And you're leading right into my next question. As we look at operating in a more constrained environment, efficiency around technology development and capabilities development is really important. So at IARPA, how do you keep that front and center on what you're doing as you look for future year planning?
So what I'd like, I'm not going to claim that we do this well today. Where I would like to go with the organization is through faster, more agile cycles of acquisition and technology transition. And the previous panel was a really great example of how many people are thinking around the important ideas that go around how we fund and acquire new technology. And I think there's a lot of good thinking. People are willing to confront and solve the hard problems around those. When I came to IARPA, I never thought that would be my answer. But the thing that I'd like to turn around and maybe ask you is, I think there's something special that the market brings to these activities. And one of the things that I think In-Q-Tel does that I'm always a little jealous of is that you talk to thousands of new companies every year about their ideas. And I think that just gives you an amazing perspective on what are the hard problems that people are actually trying to solve. We end up talking to a lot of IC S&T leads or operations leads, and we talk about what capabilities they would want. But I'm jealous of your being able to just kind of swim in that sea of new ideas that people are trying.
Yeah, and I think it's a really great point, and that's how we've been able to find a lot of really impactful companies. I think having a good sense of what is available in the startup ecosystem and looking at the trends across the space is very helpful. And I think there's a few things you could take advantage of by doing that. The first is you get to leverage private capital, and the government does not foot the bill for everything you're doing. We have a 40-to-1 leverage model, and 1 government dollar to 40 private capital dollars put into companies. So from an efficiency standpoint, that is really taking advantage of where the private sector is going. But when I look at it from the startup ecosystem, the reason they like working with a model like IQT is we understand what the government's problems are. And that's, as the last panel talked about, a very opaque space, and it's hard to get a good insight into that. But they are always looking for somebody who has a government application to go out and validate the technology, to try it out, to say, does this actually meet a mission use case that I have? And by doing that connecting of the dot with end users in the IC and the companies, they're able to go back to their investors and say, there is a government market behind this technology. And then it makes the whole cycle work because they understand they can pursue their commercial market while also going down a government market.
And there is a little overlap. And very often people, well, I wouldn't say very often, but it isn't rare for companies to hire their second employee under IARPA funding, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah.
And so there is some overlap with the kind of startup space you look at. We are responding to people who respond to our funding opportunities, and so I think there's also an advantage to just surveying a kind of huge swath of what that space looks like.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. All right, and you get to see some tremendous technology at IARPA, so I'm going to dig into a couple of those areas. So we've heard a lot today about AI and machine learning, and IARPA has several programs that have really pushed the envelope on machine learning, such as the Troje AI program. First, can you briefly explain the focus of the Troje AI program and why protecting AI models from embedded threats is a priority for the intelligence community?
Yeah, so a point that I could have made in the last question as well is IARPA works very hard to make sure we're not competing with existing markets. So that, again, we don't do the coolest stuff by, broadly writ. We do the subset of those really important IC questions that are not being met by the broader market. And I think the space of AI safety is one of those that, not that companies, Anthropic's doing a great job at looking at those, but the intelligence community is going to be using AI tools. They're just too powerful. We know we're going to be using these tools. So that how can we use these tools when human lives are on the line as safely as possible? And so Troje AI answered a very central question to that. And so kind of around the middle of the 2010s, there were these series of studies that came out, and the first ones were for image recognition software. And what they found they could do is they could put a piece of tape on a stop sign, let's say, and they could then retrain the image recognition software to view it as a yield sign, or a no right turn sign, or whatever you wanted to. And it wasn't that hard to do. So we called that, putting a kind of Trojan horse attack in those AI systems. And what Trojan AI wanted to do was understand, well, how do you know that the software you just downloaded doesn't have some compromise in those, right? How do you know that, if I'm wearing a smiley face button, I'm all of a sudden invisible to the camera because something's telling me to remove this person from the screen. And what Trojan AI did, it did a series of something like 15 or 20 different competitions where we would we would both try to Trojan, we would try to compromise AI and ML software. And then, some performers would work on the compromise, and other performers would work on then being able to detect whether they had been compromised. And for some of those cases, something like 90% of them in some of the image recognition cases could be identified from the weights alone, which is really interesting because you wouldn't think the weights would have a pointer there. But I've talked to other AI experts who say, yeah, actually you can deduce a lot of information about recent training from the weights alone there. And so that's what Trojan AI was all looking at. Trojan AI ended a few months ago, or maybe it's ending soon, but we're right about at the transition of that. And we're looking to kind of other programs that will help us do the same thing. IARPA doesn't have the billions of dollars that are required to kind of train a foundation model. What we want to be able to do is give the intelligence community tools to help them understand when these models are safe, when they've been compromised, and so on.
Yeah. And have the teams decided which directions you'll be looking into next as this program winds down and looking at your next AI capabilities, or is it still under wraps at the moment?
No, we are looking at, Trojan AI started before large language models were the norm. And by the end of it, we did our last competition around large language models. And I think what we want to be able to do is understand in the next round, what kind of training SKUs are brought into a large language model that might give unintended consequences. What type of hallucinations are going on? Okay. Do you want hallucinations some of the time? How do you know when a model's hallucinating? And then how can we make sure that those models can be trained on classified data and not spew out that data if you ask them nicely? And if you read the literature in jailbreaking large language models, sometimes it really just takes asking them in the right way. And so we want to be able to understand, again, the IC wants to be able to use these tools when people's lives are on the line. And so if we're going to train it on classified data, how do we make sure that data isn't compromised down the road in a way that threatens our resourges?
Yeah, no, that's critical because we need the tools to be safe for the intelligence community's purposes.
And again, we're going to use, right? We're going to be using them everywhere. So we just need to make sure that we can use them in a way that's responsible and verifiable, let's say.
And we're seeing from the commercial market, a lot of companies who are, the past 2 years or so, are looking at this seriously of how do you look at the vulnerabilities of the models, including the big model providers. But it is encouraging to see startups who are going out there, their whole business is focused on vulnerability assessments, red teaming for AI solutions, building large language models that you can investigate how things are working inside of them. And looking at this, I think this helps the commercial ecosystem because these tools are getting commercialized out there, but it's also raising the conversation around the safety of the models, which as consumers, we should all be happy about that. But as you look at the IC, the more tools in the toolbox to investigate these areas, the better prepared and the safer these models are going to be for our use.
Yeah.
So another area that you say IARPA and people say quantum, this is an area that IARPA has a storied history in. So let's dig into that a little bit. I think everybody in the room is tracking that quantum computing really has the potential to revolutionize a lot of areas, including cybersecurity. So IARPA launched a program to solve error-prone building blocks of quantum computing. First, you have to explain to me what that is, Rick, so we're all on the same page, and then we're going to dig into what that program did.
Yeah, so I actually want to back up a little bit and kind of go through our kind of trajectory to get where we are. So one of the early actually IARPA's first program ever was a quantum computing program. It was called Coherent Superconducting Qubits, I believe. But shortly thereafter, we started a program called MQCO, Multi-Qubit Coherent Operations. And this was one of the really foundational programs that the government did to kind of prove that you could make quantum devices, you could run simple circuits on them, and get the right answer most of the time, which is really all you could do with the capability of the devices at that time. But a lot of the commercial ecosystem today, came out of that original program. We had some of the original trapped ions, ion traps were designed in that program, and Google or the capability that Google acquired, and IBM was an early performer on MQCO as well. But we know that quantum computers make many more mistakes than classical computers. When the first ENIAC, when the first big classical computer, the ENIAC was built, that was already accurate to something like 1 part in 10 to the 15 operations. So they had actually developed theory for how to correct errors and then realized that they didn't need them for those computers. And today's transistors are corrected something like 1 in 10 to the 28. I mean, cosmic rays hitting a transistor are an appreciable contributor to the errors that they make. Today's quantum computers make many, many more errors than that. 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. These are the types. So, kind of the inverse of that error rate is roughly how many operations you can do without making a mistake. And 100 or 1,000 operations on a computer doesn't really get you very far. So we know, first people discovered early on that you can correct errors in quantum computers, and that wasn't immediately obvious because you can't arbitrarily copy quantum information. But people figured out ways to do error correction on these, and the difficulty is that it comes at a large overhead to those expenses. So, even for kind of simple error corrections, you're talking about a factor of somewhere between 10 to a 50. And we think for kind of utility scale quantum computing, that could go up to 1,000 or more redundancy that you have to build into those systems to really get the kind of final accuracy you need out of these. So IARPA started a program 8 or so years ago called Logic. So in the vocabulary of the field, we call kind of uncorrected quantum bits, the bits we use on a quantum computer, we call those physical qubits. And what we do when we introduce error correction is we build in redundancy to make logical qubits. And again, that's the logical qubits. That's where you get those factors of 10 to 15 redundancy that you're building in. So what Logic looked at was just can we build logical qubits Again, kind of like MQCO wanted to do. What's the simplest thing we can test that isn't totally trivial? So, can we build logical qubits that make errors less likely? And that's what logic showed. And now our current program is called ELK, which stands for Entangled Logical Qubits. And that looks at, can we do something with these logical qubits that again, give the right answer at the end of the day? And so what we are trying to do is an operation called quantum teleportation, where you take a quantum state over here, and you do some operations, and you wind up with that state over here. But you want to make sure that you have the right answer at the end of the day. And so we have a great set of performers under that. We always are very lucky to have great institutions proposing and performing for IARPA projects. And they're really making exciting progress in both. I think so one of the things you want to be able to do in these error-corrected qubits is you only correct errors if since you're building in so much redundancy in terms of operations you need to do, you need a certain accuracy before that redundancy breaks even, before you actually get fewer errors out than errors in. And that's called the threshold of the error correction code. And so Google kind of published the first sub-threshold qubit earlier this year in a paper they did using an error correction code called the surface code. Only a few weeks later, one of the ELK performers from Harvard published the second sub-threshold code. And so we were particularly proud that IARPA is still competing in a world, particularly where the commercial ecosystem has gotten so good as well. We're really seeing great vision and great capabilities that are being developed in the commercial world now. And I guess the other thing that I'll brag about ELK is that we're now seeing commercial partners that are actually, one of the ELK teams is a team of theorists that is just using commercial quantum hardware to do their demonstrations for ELK. And so, we always knew that day would come at some point. So in MQCO, basically we were funding people to build their own qubits out of, baling wire and duct tape. But we knew that at some point, there would be a commercial ecosystem for our building these, and I think it's exciting that the commercial cloud performers are really good enough now that you can be a performer on a cutting edge research project by just using existing cloud quantum computing resources.
No, that's fantastic. And looking at all of the different architectures and approaches that can be used with this technology and looking how far it's actually gone commercially is great. And then you can also leverage the dollars behind those very large providers to accelerate the technology. Can you talk to us about how you think these breakthroughs in the quantum space might affect intelligence missions as you look to the future, and how you would operate if you have access to this type of technology?
Yeah, so I think Mac in the previous panel mentioned Quantum Zero Day, which is the day where we think we're going to have a quantum computer powerful enough to break existing cryptosystems. People always ask me when I think that's going to be, and I try to pick a date that's safely after I retire. But I honestly don't know. Kind of every factor of 10 you go up in technology, I feel like you have to solve a different impossible problem. And we're still several impossible problems away from really getting to Quantum Zero Day. And I shouldn't say impossible, it's a little flippant. Very, very hard problems that great people need to think deeply about. So what IARPA tries to do is, to the greatest extent possible, stay on the cutting edge of that field and help extrapolate how far the field is moving, and understanding, when is the technology going to plateau versus when is it going to leap ahead. So, the other side of it is some amazing work done by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, in developing post-quantum crypto systems. So, probably this audience is familiar a little bit with how hard it is to develop a good crypto system. People will publish something and then somebody finds some really obscure mathematical fact that makes the whole thing fall apart all of a sudden. And what NIST did 10 years ago, they released a number of candidate technologies that people could build post-quantum crypto systems on. And these are often based on something called lattice cryptography. And just, I think, a year ago, they then released 4 final candidates for those that, to my knowledge, have gone the better part of a year without, so these are now systems that you can take, you can download, you can implement them, you can poke at them and see where they fall apart. And I think that they've made it through a year without people saying, aha, there's this huge, thing. Mm-hmm. And I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to NIST for taking on the kind of magnitude of a problem that was required in developing these systems. And I'm not a crypto expert, and so I probably don't get to say whether I'm optimistic or not. But maybe for my position of quasi-ignorance, I'm hopeful at least that these are going to hold together well enough that we can then replace our public key crypto systems with something that won't be broken by the next quantum computer.
Yeah, and that ties exactly to where I was going to go next. Looking at some of the earlier conversations on global strategic competition and where things are, how do you feel that we fit into the quantum race in that space compared to where others are in the innovation ecosystem?
Again, I'm very optimistic of the United States technical lead. I think we have a rich ecosystem here. Quantum is often a hard field to innovate in because often you have to make microelectronic devices that are at the very limits of fabrication capabilities. And not everyone has access to the latest and greatest foundries. So it's an expensive field to innovate in. But if you look around the ecosystem now, I think you see a healthy mixture of large companies, the Googles and the IBMs, and then smaller companies that are making contributions to this field and trying out new ideas. And I think so this example that I mentioned a little while ago from Harvard that was the second sub-threshold code that someone developed. That was a technology that's based on neutral atoms, so as opposed to ions, that the entire field, myself included, thought was never going to amount for anything, based on just how hard it was to load a kind of closely packed lattice of these. And someone came up with an idea of using these optical tweezer arrays to do it, and within 2 years, this was now a leading technology. And so it's there are still surprising things that happen, capabilities that just develop and rapidly become state of the art.
Yeah.
And that's one of the exciting things about the quantum field.
Yeah, no, it's been great to watch, and I remember seeing that article come out. It definitely caught a lot of people off guard, but really great development to see.
I mean, just to underscore it a little bit, I used to run the quantum computing program at Sandia National Labs. I had a neutral atom department under me, and I still didn't see just how fast those capabilities would move. I mean, it was one of those things where you didn't see it until it was already done.
Yeah.
And that's what's most fun about this type of technology development that InQtel, that we do here in the intelligence community, that there is so much surprise.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And having talked about post-quantum cryptography, I'm going to take you down the cybersecurity path next, because this is really important when you look from a national security aspect. So what areas of cybersecurity, whether offensive or defensive, do you believe are the most ripe for innovation? And could you benefit from deeper partnerships with academia or industry in any of these areas?
Yeah, I think in general, AI is going to change cybersecurity dramatically. And I think there's an argument to be made for just investing in cutting edge technologies there just so you can watch them. Just so you can see what people are trying to do. I can't remember who I stole this phrase from, but somebody said spy versus spy is going to be replaced by AI versus AI. And I think that's a good way of kind of looking at how cybersecurity is going to change. IARPA's current main program in cybersecurity is something called Rescind, which is looking at cyber psychology. And basically, the idea is if Las Vegas can use all of these cognitive biases to make you gamble longer and lose more money, can we use some of the same biases to make hackers waste time, to make them loss averse, so they keep going down paths that aren't going to yield anything, protect our systems by basically using the kind of psychological quirks of hackers against themselves.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and the program manager, Kimberly Ferguson Walker, was really a kind of pioneer in this area, and this was another example of someone coming to us from an intelligence agency with a need identified that she really wanted to develop. But that then begs the question, what happens when the hackers are AI systems? Can we identify whatever the analog of cognitive biases are for AI systems, or how do we protect against them? And I think it's exciting and scary at the same time.
Yes, I definitely agree. We're seeing AI in the commercial market being applied to some different areas as well when we think about the cyber realm. There's two big trends that we're seeing from the commercial ecosystem, where we are seeing people either using AI to be smarter in how they do their security operations centers and really amplify what a single analyst can do with the AI tools. One analyst can do the work of 100 analysts. So to your point of the AI doing the job for the analysts, how do you find the best, the alerts they need to be looking for? How do you help drive decision-making around those alerts and help them be very efficient as a workforce is just not scaling with the data that we're seeing in the available to the analysts to look at?
Yeah, I always, back when I was in academia, I always wanted to create a seminar series called My Bright Science Fiction Future, where I would take all the science fiction books I like to read and figure out what it would take to make all the technologies work in them. And there's some great AI-assisted hacking tools that come out of William Gibson and other places that are now starting to look more like science fact than science fiction.
No, it's great. And then we're seeing also, which is pretty interesting, we're seeing AI companies looking from offensive lenses. So how do you do the red teaming? How do you take advantage of different vulnerabilities built into software systems? So I think the commercial market around that is not quite proven at the moment, but we are seeing people take AI systems and do some really crazy things with them from a cyber perspective. So when we think about defending all of these systems 5 years down the road, it's going to be a completely different game than it is today.
Someone I know called it jump ball on AI, and I think that's a good way to look for it. And I think I'm excited to see aggressive investment across government as well, because I think it's something government's going to need.
Yes.
Again, I think the way that, one of the ways you can protect yourself against the technical risk is just to kind of have a toe in the water of, mixing metaphors here, whatever the cutting edge is there, just so that you can understand what the latest and greatest can and can't do.
Yeah, no, I strongly agree. So, Dr. Muller, if I take a step back and I look at our audience who comes from a number of different sectors here, we all with a common theme of looking at the national security community and how we help our nation state protected. How can organizations like IQT and the others in the room really partner and align with IARPA to help accelerate innovation on behalf of the IC?
So I think, so I wanted to touch on something we saw earlier that I think is exciting. So, you know, I talked about the size of the DoD ecosystem versus the IC ecosystem. And the DoD is this mythical land where there are lots of people that will develop things, and we in the IC have to really work hard to lift our technologies up. What we're seeing is a lot of private equity coming into these fields. And so there are companies like Palantir and Anduril now today that are doing things that were kind of traditionally government investments that are being leveraged in kind of dual use applications as well. And I think it makes sense that you know, maybe as more information technology just becomes technology, that some of those dual uses around IC applications might become, you know, more prevalent in the marketplace. So I'm hopeful about that. I think the IC and IARPA need to change in the way that we bring people in to let them solve our problems. There's this really amazing capability website that DIA put out called Needopedia. And what they do is they survey all of their partners for their you know, hardest problems. They then figure out, you know, unclassified proxies for all of those, and they put them on a website. And they solicit white papers for those. And since they're posted on a website, it satisfies some of the contracting laws about notifications for certain amounts of time. And they can then very rapidly work with companies and bring in new ideas rapidly, you know, rather than having to go through, you know, a kind of, you know, year-long process where you're putting out a request for information and you're putting out a broad agency announcement and you're receiving proposals and you're evaluating them. You know, they can then very rapidly get money out to people. DARPA is another agency that's worked very, very hard at finding ways of getting those timelines down to make it possible for more people to work as partners with DARPA and the DoD.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point too, because if you can distill it down in a way that it can be accessible to a much larger audience, you get the whole force of the private sector helping solve the problems that the IC needs.
And you also enable people that, you know, smaller companies that just may not be able to work with FAR-based contracting, you know, and just bring in a kind of wider set of companies and capabilities.
Yeah, and that ties perfectly to our first audience question. So what strategies are you using to reduce dependencies on foreign or outsourced pieces in critical technology components? I know this has been a hot topic as we look at this, and I know this is something very important to the IC as you look at how we do tech development.
So I'm not sure we've got the ultimate answer for this. We do look closely at supply chains and try to ensure that they're local. We had a good battery program called Resilience that was looking at specific battery needs that the intelligence community has. And some of the performers there actually developed battery formulations that had all domestic supply chains to them. So we're happy when we get them. I think supply chain analysis is something that we need to do a better job of bringing in early on in our technology development, so that we don't develop technologies that require us to be beholden to trading partners that we might not want to be dependent upon.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think looking at some of the raw componentry around a lot of this, and as you're designing products, taking that into consideration at the front and at the end of the programs is also an important piece. And then this next question is a really interesting one, and I think it's key to folks who have not worked as close with IARPA. So how does IARPA collaborate with the specific intelligence agencies to align with their mission needs? In looking at all of the agencies you have to work with, this is a big contingency of input that you could be aligning against. So how do you do that kind of pairing to make sure you're really strategically aligned to serve the agencies?
Yeah, so, we do a lot of outreach. So, we go to their performer days, we end up talking to their directors of science and technology, and then again, we have, we to the greatest extent possible, we ensure that we've got program managers that either come from IC agencies or that we can give strong ties to interesting agencies to help develop those ideas. And really, it all starts with a great idea and a kind of 200-word write-up of that. But what we want to make sure is between the time that we have that great idea and when IARPA gives the final thumbs up that you can make a program out of this, that we contact every single interested IC element and understand, well, do you have concerns about these things? Where would you need this technology to go? What are things that we want to do in the open? What are things that we don't want to do in the open? And we work through a very long list of questions to make sure that at the end of the day, we can provide those agencies with the greatest capabilities at the end of an IARPA program.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And having spent some time going through the IARPA website before today, it was also very clear from the website of looking at different focus areas. So I think from the private sector perspective, there's a good visibility into where you're looking to go that you can keep building off of. But it was very informative as you think of, I want to partner with IARPA. How do I go about doing that? It gave you a good framework. All right, our next question is looking in a slightly different direction, asking about whether or not you think there are basic scientific research areas that are critical for S&T policy moving forward that will help us with our breakthroughs needed for the IC in the future. So taking us a little bit back to the basic research, if there's anything front and center in your mind.
Well, we've already talked about quantum and AI, and those are two great examples where there are still basic questions being answered that impact how those fields evolve. So just to kind of throw out something that surprised me when the program manager came up with it, and maybe this is more applied research than basic research, but solar panels. There's huge investment going on in solar panels all over the world now. So you wouldn't think there'd be needs for new ideas in those. But of course, the intelligence community is interested in solar panels on satellites very often, right? We're interested in fueling satellites in space. And many of us are familiar with kind of the limitations that solar panels have. Kind of single junction solar panels, I think it's called the Shockley-Queisner limit, are limited to something like 28% efficiency. Just based on kind of basic semiconductor math. It's actually much lower than that in space for a surprising reason. It's because the solar panels get too hot and there's nothing to carry away the heat. So even though we think about space as being very, very cold, it's actually cooling the solar panels in those space environments that are limiting the efficiency of solar panels in space. And so we've got a program called Solstice that wants to kind of look at system solutions to putting solar panels in space in a way that kind of derives greater power density out of them.
Oh, that's fantastic. I would not have thought that was a problem, but that's very interesting.
Again, it's always the surprises that are the most fun. But most areas, we don't do National Science Foundation type investments in basic research, but almost all of the programs we run have some element of basic science in them. Whether it's the space technologies or language tools or biometric identifications or what have you.
Oh, that's great. And we got a number of quantum questions from the audience, so I'm going to pull you back to quantum for a minute. In your view, what is the biggest barrier to operationalizing quantum, and how is IARPA addressing this? So we touched on some of the recent breakthroughs, but when you look at getting this operational, is there anything that stands out in your mind?
Well, so there's still a big gap between how many quantum bits we can make today and how many we think we're going to need. And estimates are that we're going to need around 1 million qubits to do something useful. Whether it's, to do a pharmaceutical application or a materials application or an optimization problem. And we are now, each of these technologies is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 quantum bits right now. So, we've got multiple orders of magnitude. And so, the issue is it's not one technology, it's a bunch of technologies.
Yeah.
And I think each of those technologies is going to have different things that limit it. Again, with this, probably oversimplified view that I have that every factor of 10 has another incredibly hard problem, I think every technology has a different problem at each factor of 10. So, let's say with these neutral atoms that went from 50 qubits to 1,000 qubits seemingly overnight, there might be limits to the types of optical traps that people make to build these tweezer arrays to trap all of the atoms in them. You might just get to a point where you can get to 5,000 atoms, but you can't get to 50,000 atoms. Superconductors are probably the most familiar capability, but there are problems superconductors have with cosmic rays, causing excited particles that create correlated errors that make a lot of the assumptions that go into our error thresholds incorrect. So I think, we don't really understand what those limiting technologies are until we confront them. I will say there's a great paper by John Martinez, who for a long time was at Google, on, I think it's called something like scaling quantum computing from hundreds to millions or something like that. And he goes through, for superconducting technology, some of the things that he thinks are going to limit it at each factor of 10. And I think it's a fun exercise to think about doing for other technologies as well, just to think, well, now you're at 10,000. What are the things that are going to be limiting that technology at 10,000? So, Martinez knows vastly more than I do about superconducting technology, but it'd be interesting to see for trapped ions, for neutral atoms, for some of these new technologies, like PsiQuantum has this photonic approach. What's going to be limiting these as we get to different scales?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting as you look at the different perspectives around it. But I agree, it's unknown at this point.
Yeah.
So we will continue to project after your retirement. So we'll all be correct on that. One more question from our audience about the types of performers that work with IARPA. There's a question about how much the academic industry plays in with what you do, or are you mainly working with private companies looking at the performers on your programs?
Yeah, we do a mix of everything. We've got large performers, companies like SRI. We've got, again, startup companies, people who hired employee number 2 under IARPA funding. And then traditionally, we do a lot of academic funding as well. And it just depends upon, what the problem is,
Okay.
and where those solutions live. But I think it's healthy to get a variety of performers on these. We're really very lucky with the people that are willing to submit to these, and would love to be able to broaden the field as much as possible.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I think I'll leave it there.
Perfect. And then I am going to end with one forward-looking question.
Okay.
I've been waiting to ask you this because I want to hear your answer. So as our adversaries are becoming more sophisticated in targeting AI systems, what emerging threats or research gaps are you most focused on addressing next at IARPA?
Well, I'm not sure I can say that we're going to address this next, but the thing that makes me most intrigued about AI is not its ability to analyze systems, but its ability to synthesize information. And very often good ideas come from that ability to kind of look across a landscape and kind of understand not what the answers are, but what are the questions you should be answering. And I think what I'm most interested in is, how can we start developing that kind of breadth and perspective from our tools, so we're not just, saying how warm is it in Chicago today, but we're looking a little bit more broadly at, what's implied by a lot of the small signals that are going on across a very wide aperture.
I think it's fantastic. And I imagine you're going to be looking at a much more rapid evolution in the types of problems that are being presented and addressed at IARPA as the technology just keeps increasing in speed.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Dr. Muller, thank you so much for your time today. That is all of our questions, and we really appreciate your conversation and teaching us more about what you are doing in emerging threats.
Okay, thanks, Megan. I really enjoyed this.
So thank you, Megan and Dr. Muller, for finishing off what's been a really great day of conversations as well as networking with our INSA members and guests. No INSA event would be complete without my recognizing our amazing sponsors, so bear with me. Accrete, AWS, CACI, Candace Solutions, Freedom Technology Solutions, Google for Government, and TUFO, LMI, Northeastern University, Oracle Cloud, SAIC, Salesforce, Seeker, Stealth Communications, Strongbox Cyber Solutions, and Summit Knowledge Solutions. A round of applause for them. And also, kudos to our programming team who put together today's event. Haley Hoffman, an INSA graduate student intern who's put a lot of sweat equity in today. My colleague John Doyen, Peggy O'Connor, Toya Rich, and Allie Bailey on our events team who were here late last night and got here around 5 o'clock this morning. I did not. If you all weren't here for my amazing opening remarks, there's two takeaways. Scan the QR code to park before you leave this floor if you parked in the parking garage. If not, again, I'll get a horrible Yelp rating for your parking experience today. I also wanted to encourage anybody who didn't hear about our AI workshop tomorrow morning in this room. I think you can register on site, right? Is somebody, yep, you can register on site if you want to show up here at 8 o'clock again tomorrow morning. And then please join us at Grand Cru right around the corner. We're going to be outside. The weather is cooperating. Compliments of Oracle Cloud. We will be having a networking reception. And then lastly, you'll be getting a survey. Please fill it out. Let us know what you thought of today's program and who you would like to hear from in the future and what topics. Everybody have a great afternoon and a good evening. Thanks so much.